A man lies on his back in a shallow pit, knees drawn up, body dusted in red ochre. Above him, a low mound of earth, what archaeologists call a kurgan, rises from the grasslands near the city of Samara. A copper scepter rests beside his hand. No inscription, no name, no written language to preserve whatever prayers or curses followed him into the ground. He was buried sometime around 3000 BCE in the classic Yamnaya position, facing east toward the rising sun over the Volga. For a century, burials like this one defined what we thought we knew about one of the most consequential populations in human history: nomadic herders, riders and wagon builders. The people who, around 5,000 years ago, supposedly poured out of the Pontic-Caspian steppe and rewrote the genetic story of an entire continent. For nearly a decade, ancient DNA seemed to confirm every piece of that narrative. Clean data, clear ancestry, case closed. Except the case was built on a model that turns out to have been structurally incomplete since the day it was published. And the evidence that broke it open was not some fringe finding. It was the largest ancient DNA study of the steppe ever conducted, led by the same lab that built the original model in the first place. The story that held from 2015 onward went like this. Two landmark studies dropped almost simultaneously. One led by Wolfgang Huck, the other by Morton Allentoft, both drawing on the revolution in ancient DNA sequencing that had transformed human genetics in under 5 years. Their conclusion, supported by dozens of Bronze Age genomes extracted from bones and teeth across Europe and Central Asia, was dramatic. The Yamnaya carried a genetic signature that appeared to be a roughly equal blend of two deep ancestral populations. About half their DNA came from Eastern hunter-gatherers, or EHG, people who had roamed the forests and river valleys of Eastern Europe since the end of the Ice Age. The other half came from Caucasus hunter-gatherers, or CHG, populations rooted in the mountain valleys of Georgia and the Southern Caucasus, thousands of kilometers to the south. A clean, almost symmetrical mix. Two ancient lineages merging on the steppe to produce something new, and the implications of that new thing were staggering. Between roughly 3000 and 2300 BCE, the Yamnaya and their descendants appeared to have replaced vast portions of the indigenous population across the entire European continent. In Britain, in Iberia, in Scandinavia, steppe ancestry surged. Among corded ware populations in Central Europe, up to 75% of ancestry derived from Yamnaya-related sources. The genetic term for their signature, Western steppe herder ancestry, became a fixture in every paper on European prehistory. And the Yamnaya became synonymous with the origin of the Indo-European language family, the family spoken today by roughly 46% of the world's population, from Icelandic to Hindi, Portuguese to Pashto. David Reich at Harvard called the Yamnaya a single genetically coherent group. David Anthony at Hartwick College, who had spent decades studying the steppe, argued they were the most likely source of Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor of languages now spoken on every inhabited continent. The genome of the man in that kurgan near Samara seemed to contain the answer to one of the oldest questions in historical linguistics, a question scholars had been debating since William Jones first noticed the resemblance between Sanskrit and Greek in 1786. That sense of resolution was powerful. It was also premature. Because the model had a quiet structural problem, and it sat in plain sight, in the Y chromosome data that everyone could see but few wanted to confront directly. The Yamnaya males who had been sampled overwhelmingly carried a specific Y DNA haplogroup, R1b Z2103. This is a paternal lineage, a genetic surname passed from father to son, unchanged across dozens of generations. If the Yamnaya were truly the direct paternal ancestors of the cultures that spread steppe ancestry across Europe, you would expect to find this lineage in their supposed descendants. You would expect it in the corded ware culture, the first major archaeological complex in Central and Northern Europe to show heavy steppe ancestry. You would expect it in modern Western Europeans, the populations that carry the most Yamnaya-derived DNA on the planet. It is not there. Corded weremales carry R1a M417 and R1b L51. These are sister lineages to the Yamnaya haplogroup, not daughter lineages. They share a deep common ancestor, branching apart sometime before 4000 BCE, but one does not descend from the other. Barry Cunliffe flagged this disconnect. So did Leo Klein, the veteran Russian archaeologist who had been skeptical of the steppe migration model from the beginning. And in 2023, Volker Heyde and colleagues at the University of Helsinki stated it with no ambiguity. The specific paternal haplogroup most common in sampled Yamnaya males cannot be found in modern Western Europeans or in corded weremales. What this means in plain terms is that the men buried in Yamnaya kurgans on the Volga were not the direct patrilineal forefathers of the people who transformed Europe's gene pool. Their autosomal DNA, the full genome signature, matches. Their paternal line does not. And paternal lines are the one thing that should be most resistant to disruption in a patrilineal, exogamous society, which is exactly what the Yamnaya appear to have been. The field worked around this. David Anthony, one of the foremost scholars of Yamnaya culture, proposed that dominant R1b clans might have been displaced by rising R1a lineages during internal social upheaval, a kind of paternal revolution within a few generations. Others suggested the problem was simpler. The sampled Yamnaya came overwhelmingly from the eastern part of the range, around Samara and the Lower Volga. The western Yamnaya, the ones closer to Europe, might have carried entirely different paternal lineages. These are reasonable hypotheses. Neither has been confirmed. And while the debate simmered in specialist journals, the public-facing narrative continued to present the Yamnaya as the uncomplicated origin point of a continental transformation. Building a migration narrative from one corner of a 5,000-kilometer cultural horizon is like reconstructing the history of the Roman Empire from a single garrison in Britain. You might get the garrison right. You will get Roman wrong. Then came the study that redrew everything. In 2024, Iosif Lazaridis at Harvard, working with Nick Patterson, David Anthony, Leonid Vyazov, David Reich, and a vast international team spanning universities from Copenhagen to Kyiv to Samara, assembled ancient DNA from 435 individuals. 299 of those genomes were reported for the first time. The samples spanned from roughly 6,400 to 2000 BCE, covering the entire Neolithic and early Bronze Age of the Pontic-Caspian region and beyond. The paper went through full peer review and was published in Nature in February 2025. This was not a blog post. This was not a preprint left to gather dust. This was the formal, corrected, definitive report. And what it revealed was not a minor adjustment. It was a demolition of the two-component model that had anchored the field for a decade. The Yamnaya did not form from that neat two-ancestry blend. Instead, the team identified three previously unknown genetic gradients stretching across the steppe and Caucasus, population corridors they called clines. The first, and most consequential, they named the Caucasus Lower Volga cline, or CLV. This was a genetic gradient running from Neolithic Armenia in the south, communities at sites like Akhnashin and Masisblur, to a site called Berezhnovka on the Lower Volga in the north. People along this corridor carried heavy Caucasus hunter-gatherer ancestry, but also Anatolian Neolithic ancestry, a component the old model had completely missed. Gene flow along the CLV was bidirectional, north and south, creating intermediate populations like the Mykop people of the North Caucasus and the communities at Remontnoye on the open steppe. The second cline, the Volga cline, formed as CLV people mixed with populations further upriver who had more traditional EHG ancestry, producing genetically hypervariable populations at sites like Khvalynsk. These were the very populations earlier studies had placed at the center of Yamnaya origins. Under the new model, they turn out to be a parallel branch, not the trunk. The third cline is the one that changes the story. CLV people, carrying both Caucasus Neolithic and Lower Volga ancestry, moved west. They crossed into what is now Ukraine and mixed with local hunter-gatherers along the Dnipro and Don rivers, people whose genetic signature had persisted in that region for millennia, stretching back to a site called Golubaya Krinitsa on the Middle Don, dated to roughly 5,600 BCE. These were not farmers. They were the last descendants of Ice Age foraging populations who had never adopted agriculture, never built permanent settlements, and never encountered the genetic influence of the Neolithic revolution that had transformed Western Europe thousands of years earlier. This fusion, CLV migrants meeting deep-rooted local foragers, produced the Seredny Stih culture, named after an island on the Dnipro where its remains were first identified. And it is from Seredny Stih communities, arrayed along this Dnipro cline, that the direct ancestors of the Yamnaya formed around 4000 BCE. If you are finding this channel through this video, the thread connecting these CLV people to the Hittites of Bronze Age Anatolia through a completely separate migration route is something we are building a dedicated video around. That connection might be the most significant finding in this entire study. Subscribe so you do not miss it. The numbers here deserve their own moment. CLV people contributed roughly 4/5 of Yamnaya ancestry, not half from the forests, half from the mountains. 4/5 from a single complex multi-sourced population corridor stretching over 1,000 kilometers from Armenia to the Volga. The remaining fifth came from Ukrainian Neolithic hunter-gatherers absorbed during the westward push. The old 50-50 model was not slightly miscalibrated. It was fundamentally wrong about how the Yamnaya came into being. And what happened next makes the revision even more striking. The team used a computational method called HAPNI-LD, designed specifically to infer effective population size changes from low-coverage ancient DNA. They split their core Yamnaya samples, 104 genetically near-identical individuals sampled from the Carpathian Basin all the way to the Altai Mountains, into two groups based on dating, the earlier 300 years and the later 300 years. Then they overlaid the two demographic trajectories. What appeared was an extraordinary population explosion. Between roughly 36 to 42 BCE and 33 to 74 BCE, the effective population size went from a few thousand to an order of magnitude larger. A community that could have occupied a handful of neighboring villages along the lower Dnipro became a demographic force numbering in the tens of thousands within a few centuries. And as they expanded, they maintained startling genetic homogeneity. Core Yamnaya buried in Hungary look essentially identical to Core Yamnaya buried near the borders of Mongolia and China. That does not happen in populations absorbing locals as they go. That is a population expanding faster than it can mix. This uniformity contrasts sharply with the Seredny Stih, who were scattered along the Dnipro cline, genetically variable, not yet consolidated into a single tight cluster. The Yamnaya, in genetic terms, are the product of a bottleneck followed by an eruption. A small, cohesive subset of Seredny Stih descendants that locked into a specific genetic profile and then swept outward across half of Eurasia. Three consequences follow, each rewriting a different chapter of the old narrative. First, the evidence shows that Yamnaya formation was geographically specific. It did not happen across the entire steppe in some broad, gradual blending process. It happened in the Dnipro-Don region, among Seredny Stih communities who were themselves a product of the CLV expansion. Mikhailivka, on the lower Dnipro in modern Kherson Oblast, has been identified as one of the core Yamnaya sites, dated to roughly 3,600 to 3,400 BCE. The Volga populations that earlier models had placed at the origin, sites like Kovalinsk, turn out to be a side channel, genetically distinct, not ancestral. Second, this rules out the idea that the Yamnaya were the original Proto-Indo-European speakers in any straightforward sense. CLV ancestry appears not only in the Yamnaya on the steppe, but also in Bronze Age Central Anatolians, at least 1/10 of the ancestry of populations who spoke Hittite. Hittite is the earliest attested Indo-European language, belonging to the Anatolian branch, which split off from the rest of the family before any other documented divergence. If both the Yamnaya and the Hittite speakers received CLV ancestry through completely different geographic routes, one west across the steppe, the other south through Mesopotamia, then the linguistic unity predates the Yamnaya entirely. It sits with the CLV people, sometime between 4,400 and 4,000 BCE. The Yamnaya were not the beginning of the Indo-European story. They were Chapter 2. Third, this implies a level of social and demographic organization among CLV communities that archaeology has barely begun to examine. A population corridor sustaining two-way genetic exchange across mountain passes and open grassland for centuries, generating the demographic raw material for multiple downstream expansions in different directions. This is not a picture of isolated nomadic bands stumbling into favorable conditions. This is a network. But the picture remains deeply incomplete. The paternal haplogroup problem laid out earlier has not been resolved by this study. Lazaridis confirmed the genetic tightness of the core Yamnaya, but that only deepens the question. Papak and colleagues found that the earliest corded ware males in Bohemia carried R1BL151, a lineage that shares a common ancestor with the Yamnaya R1BZ2-103, but branched off before either culture existed, suggesting the split happened among pre-Yamnaya steppe groups that remain poorly sampled. Morton Allentoft's 2024 work suggested the corded ware formed rapidly through genetic amalgamation of steppe-related groups with the globular amphora culture of Eastern Europe, not through direct Yamnaya migration. This matters because it means the largest ancestry shift in European prehistory may not have been driven by the Yamnaya at all, but by a related population that coalesced independently. Cline raises another point that no one has adequately answered. If the Yamnaya migration was the primary driver, you would expect the highest concentration of steppe-derived DNA closest to the Yamnaya homeland, decreasing with distance. Instead, steppe ancestry peaks in Scandinavia and the Baltic and is comparatively lower in Hungary, right at the western edge of the Yamnaya range. The gradient runs the wrong direction for a simple westward wave. Something more complex happened, something involving multiple source populations, differential mixing rates, founder effects at the leading edge, and possibly the selective survival of certain communities over others as they moved into forested environments radically different from the dry steppe. The Lazaridis team locates the Proto-Indo-Anatolian homeland in the CLV region and the Proto-Indo-European homeland specifically in the Seredni Stach culture. But they acknowledge that which CLV subgroup gave rise to the Yamnaya ancestors remains uncertain. The cline is long, sampling is still sparse in critical stretches, and the Seredni Sti themselves were genetically diverse enough that pinpointing the exact founding cluster is not yet possible. Lazaridis put it carefully in an interview with Haaretz. There was nothing inherently superior about the CLV people. They had the right technology at the right time, and a small random group that emerged just after 4000 BCE had an outsized impact on human history through a combination of luck and a few favorable cultural features. There is also the question of what triggered the explosion itself. The Yamnaya adopted wheeled transport and intensive mobile pastoralism at roughly the same time their population surged. Ox-drawn wagons made it possible, for the first time, to carry water, supplies, and shelter into deep steppe that had previously been inaccessible for year-round habitation. Cattle could be herded across vast distances. Seasonal camps could become seasonal territories. Whether this technological package enabled the demographic surge directly, or whether both innovations and population growth were symptoms of a deeper organizational shift in how Seredny communities managed herds, territory, and kinship alliances, remains an open question. A study published in Nature in January 2024 found that Yamnaya-associated gene variants significantly increasing the risk of multiple sclerosis were introduced to northwestern Europe during the Bronze Age, affecting over 2.5 million people today. Whatever advantage those immune system variants conferred on the open steppe, strong enough to be selected for despite the autoimmune cost, we are still living with the consequences. What we do know is that a population small enough to fit inside a single river valley, living along the lower Dnipro sometime around 3750 BCE, underwent a demographic event so extreme that their genetic signature is now detectable in people living from Reykjavik to Dhaka, from the highlands of Scotland to the river plains of northern India. Right now, in labs between Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Copenhagen, Denmark, ancient DNA teams are still processing bones pulled from the CLV region. Every new genome narrows the cline, sharpens the timeline, and pushes the origin of the languages spoken by nearly half of all living humans further back and further south than anyone imagined a decade ago. Somewhere in a university freezer, there is a petrous bone from a Seredny woman or a CLV herder along the Lower Volga that has not been sequenced yet. When it is, it might answer the question that this entire field is now circling. The Yamnaya are not gone from this story, but they are no longer where it starts.